start up on Twitch. It's not really starting anywhere. Oh, there we go. There we go. All right, so we're now live. Hooray!
Woohoo!
So welcome everybody to this other set of Hiveworks streams. So we're going to be doing only 4 this weekend compared to last weekend's 8. So essentially we have the speculative fiction study hall today at 1 at 2 o'clock. We've got interview with I believe it's an interview. Let me just check that. Yeah, at 2 we've got the interview with the people who do the webcomic Folklore, and tomorrow we have at 1 o'clock a sort of little stream about what good comics to read, comic suggestions, and at 2 o'clock that day we've got an interview with the author of RPG. So a couple of interesting things. This is the speculative fiction study hall. This is sort of like us branching into more regular streams on the theme of fantasy, because the first stream we did for fantasy, immediately we noticed that this topic was super broad. It actually required several several check-ins to talk about it. So we're sort of gonna just have several speculative fiction streams and go over different topics. So because the last one was so vast and kind of really quickly devolved into us talking about things we didn't like, we're sort of going to talk more about the genre itself today. So sort of the difference between high fantasy and low fantasy as a starting point, and how that sort of works with webcomics and all that stuff. So with me today in the stream, returning from the previous stream, we've got Ali, who does the webcomics Tigress, Queen, Far to the North, and Persephone, which is in print, and you can get it in our store, and it's awesome. We have Misha, who does Alice in the Nightmare, and is also going to have their first book for Alice in the Nightmare pretty soon. That's been delayed because of the pandemic. You may have heard of it.
Yep. Stuff's rough.
Rings a bell.
Yeah, you may have heard of the pandemic and how it's been sort of affecting everything in our lives. So wait, is my audio picking up? I'm not getting any indication that it is.
I mean, we can hear you fine.
Yeah.
That's really weird.
We hear you.
Oh. Okay, there's possibly some lag. That's really weird. So I apologize if that's the case. So yeah, so soon book after, as soon as pandemic sort of stops. That would be great. We have
That'd be just swell.
Yeah, that'd be great. We have Meg, who's here too, who is the author of Daughter of the Lilies, with a new chapter. It's going to start soon as well. Delayed by Meg sorting some work stuff. We really hope you get it. We hope you get it.
Thanks, guys.
Get those storyboarding contracts. You can do it. We believe in you.
Yeah. Working up.
So, yeah. let's talk about fantasy. So it's kind of interesting to talk about high fantasy versus low fantasy, because there's not a huge difference between them, I find. The main difference is sort of how immersive the world is. Like, a lot of people, the way to divide it is it's low fantasy if you're in the real world, and it's sort of an urban fantasy thing, or you have a couple details around. But like, if it's only like, oh, these guys are fairies but the rest of us are humans with the internet, then it's low fantasy. And high fantasy is more like a full immersive world, whether it's existing in parallel with the real human world or not. So among here, we've actually got a lot of people who do works that could be described as high fantasy, because Ali, almost all your comics are in other worlds, except Persephone, I guess, but it's with gods, so it's like a technicality. So, but you have Tigress.
Want it to be.
Yeah, you have Tigress Queen, who's in a fully different world. You've got Farther North, that's in a fully different world, that also has bonus dragons, which is nice. Megan, you also have Daughter of the Lilies, which occurs not so much, I don't know if that's a spoiler, it's not so much another world, but it's our world very much in the future.
It's post-apocalyptic, yeah.
Yeah, so a bit of
Fun
like
future.
yeah, a bit of an Adventure
The fun
Time
future.
mood. Yeah. It's kind of like Adventure Time, like we bombed ourselves out and then cool shit happened.
I'm
Wizards.
excited to go into how that happened, but won't say too much to that here.
And we have Alice in the Nightmare, who obviously is also high fantasy because it's a fully different world, but it is attached to our world since it crosses over with dreams, because the denizens of Wonderland have to collect dreams to exist. So let's talk about it. You guys ended up all doing high fantasy works, even though, you know, you weren't necessarily thinking about that when you decided to start your comic. Like, did you, when you start your comic, go like, ah, yes, this is I'm consciously choosing another world? Like, Ali, why don't you start?
Yeah. I just like fantasy in general. Like, I don't really care for other genres, to be honest. So, like, why would I want to be in the real world when I can literally make up my own, and then I don't step on any, like, cultural toes or have anyone tell me that, like, oh, this is historically inaccurate, except they already do, even though it's in a fantasy world. Like, just,
You
I
mean
can
those
do
whole
whatever I
talks
want
of
with it.
like, oh, you know, back in the day, like, women didn't use swords, they were more spear users, and you're like, who the freak cares?
No, I
How'd you get in
literally
my
had
house?
someone complain that the windows in Far to the North were too big and the couches were too modern, and it's like, okay, there's
What?
gonna be electricity later on. Can you shut up? There's dragons here. This isn't the real world.
So that's an interesting, like, kind of hot take right off the bat. Like, fantasy is the best genre, according to me.
It is.
So, is there a specific version, like, why you think high fantasy and being in an immersive world is sort of, like, more fun for you for writing? Like, is urban fantasy fully off the table for you, or is that something that you might
I don't
wanna...
dislike urban fantasy. I just prefer high fantasy, like just being someplace else. Like the main reason I like fantasy is for the possibilities, and when you have urban fantasy, like, yes, there are some possibilities, but at the same time, you're really only changing a few things, and the more you change, the less urban fantasy it becomes, and just the more off the wall it gets. So with high fantasy, you can literally just do whatever you want.
So it's essentially, like, freedom that you prefer. Although, I mean, one could argue that urban fantasy doesn't necessarily have limitations either. Like, I'm thinking about a vintage offers like Clamp that literally have the end of the world. I mean, is Clamp vintage? It's from the 90s. Is it vintage
They're
now?
vintage.
Am I
That was
old?
my childhood.
Yeah, am I old now? That is the question. But yeah, that's
I feel like it's your parents' childhood before it becomes vintage.
But then it sort of varies because we have people that we work with that their parents are like our age. Well, at least my age. Like,
Doofa.
yeah, I was talking to a Hiveworks creator, and they're like, yeah, my parents are 41, and I'm like, ooh, ouch. I feel that.
No, I had that I'm getting old moment the other day because usually in comics group I am baby, but I was watching like a Resident Evil Let's Play the other day, and the person was like, "Oh, this is from 1996. It's older than me," and I just felt myself crumble into dust.
Oh, that hurts. Oh, so painful. What about
Not
you?
that it helps much.
Yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt. My uncle has a saying that youth is temporary, but immaturity lasts a lifetime. And I hold that very close to my heart the more years go on.
That's good. That's good. I love that.
What
Anyway,
about?
sorry to interrupt, Issa.
No worries. It's a discussion. Nobody. I'm not gonna off with her head immediately. What about you guys? Like, why high fantasy instead of urban fantasy? Or
May I? Oh,
sorry?
I'm sorry. May I ask a question real quick about that?
Yeah.
What are like the specific characterizations of each? Because in my comic, like there are, I guess, situations where you could technically classify it as urban fantasy because they are technically in a city versus high fantasy when they go out of the city and into what is technically the wilderness and do their jobs. So what like is
See,
more
Meg. Like, you're in a
yeah.
city, but it's not like real city. It's
Okay.
medieval
Yeah.
magic city.
The difference
Okay,
is
so
literally
it's-
high fantasy is
Like, the city-
you're not here. You're in a fully different world. It could be like a modern world, but
Okay.
like that what's a good example? Like, because there is science fiction that is essentially sort of a bit on the fantasy tab too. If you think about stuff like Star Wars, it's just Earth does not exist.
Okay.
I would consider
Okay,
Harry
I can
Potter
work.
to be urban fantasy. That takes place in our world. It's just a hidden part of it.
Yeah, secret worlds are low fantasy because the human world has an impact, and I think the human world having an impact in works like Harry Potter is actually super interesting because, like, okay, Harry Potter's got some problems, but the whole fact that the human world is both a source of trauma and protection for Harry is like, it's poetry. It's genius. I love it. Because he has to stay with his aunt and uncle or he's screwed, you know? He's going to get attacked every day of his life. But also, he hates it and it's horrible. And I'm just like, oh, poetic cinema. I love that thing so much. And it just goes so well with the whole wizarding world aspect too. It's beautiful. But yeah, the main difference is just high fantasy is elsewhere and low fantasy is here.
Okay.
But like, you have different levels in low fantasy. You can have really, really low fantasy where it's just a detail. Like, a good example is Jumanji. Like, Jumanji, the game, the evil game that sucks you in, exists. But seemingly nothing else magical does. It's just, there's a cursed game. That's it.
Just one curse.
You can have the one curse as a treat. So there's the one curse, but seemingly nothing else is real. And then you have stuff that's in low fantasy that is, where you have like a lot of magical people, but they're not sort of interacting with people, like Carnival or Harry Potter or Anne Rice's universe.
Okay, cool.
So low fantasy actually has levels, which is interesting. You can have stuff that's really, like Freaky Friday counts as a low fantasy story because there's one thing that's magical that happens, but then nothing else.
Yeah.
Damn.
Well, I mean, same with like Groundhog Day, which like,
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, we could sit here coming up with an example all day.
Well,
That tracks.
anything Groundhog Day-ish, unless it's explained with science, counts as low fantasy. Like Groundhog Day, never explained, counts as fantasy. Russian Doll, never explained, counts as low fantasy, and is also a great show. But then you have like the Happy Death Day movies that are also a loop, and that people should totally watch because I want to talk about them. But like it's a dumb teen comedy with a Groundhog Day / murder twist, but it's caused by like a science experiment, so it's actually sci-fi. But
would you say that's where the line between fantasy? Oh, sorry.
Sorry?
Would you say that's where like the line falls between fantasy and sci-fi? That like maybe sci-fi has an explanation, whereas like fantasy doesn't really offer one?
I feel like that's kind of the
difference.
To
explain it, or it, like sci-fi will take place on a different planet, and they will make sure you know that it's a different planet, but it's literally just fantasy.
Yeah. But even then, you could argue that it's sci-fantasy. Like in the 70s, they had the weird genre, which now evolved into new weird, where it's literally what happens when you take sci-fi and fantasy and horror and you mix it together. Like that's an actual genre in itself. But if you're like on Earth, or like if you're on Earth, the difference between sci-fi and fantasy is often how you explain it, I feel. Because otherwise it's hard to sort of like cut it. Like it's because you have a lot of stories that have technological prowess, but it's like magical also. But then you have stories that it's purely technical and you're like, oh, well, this is more like science fiction. Or like if the explanation is aliens are not magic. They're just incomprehensible. Like I think about stuff like Arrival that has a lot of the feelings of fantasy because it's so strange. But it's so obviously sci-fi because everything is scientific and sort of has this scientific point of view, and it's aliens. Like the two leads are science people, you know? One's a linguist and the other one's a quantum physicist.
Yeah. You could say the same about Annihilation too.
Annihilation definitely has more horror elements though.
Yeah.
Ooh, did you guys see that they actually adapted The Color Out of Space as a movie with Nick Cage?
Oh,
what is that?
So Color Out of Space is actually it's a H.P. Lovecraft novel, which a lot of people have said Annihilation is basically that. It's basically there's a comet that falls into a well, and all the stuff around it becomes super weird, magical, colorful, and transforms into like mixes of things. So basically it's Annihilation, you know. It's the same story, but the angle is completely different. Like obviously the movie is like has a feminine perspective and is about trauma and stuff like that, whereas Colors Out of Space is just about like what if aliens came and they just melted the entire countryside into like someone who just discovered the halo brush on Photoshop. And
it's a lot of pink in this poster, I can tell you that.
Yeah. So essentially it's really weird that like I guess it's because Annihilation did really good, so they were like, oh, we should just straight up adapt The Color Out of Space, which is kind of the inspiration for that story. And they did, and they put Nicolas Cage in it, which is
that's
amazing.
A choice.
Yeah, it's a strong choice. That's a statement. So I kind of want to see it now because I'm like, huh. But yeah,
that's good.
Annihilation is definitely more sci-fi because again, at the end there's like an alien, so anything incomprehensible can just be sort of explained away by like we have stupid meat brains that don't understand alien power.
I feel like that might be the line drawn is like in the explanation of either it's magic, so we don't gotta explain it, or it's aliens, so we also don't gotta explain it.
But on the offhand, you have people who like make the magic really precise and explainy. Like I actually want Meg's opinion on this because we just like did editorial on a chapter that's a lot of magic explanation.
Yes, there's a lot of dumbing things down to be more easily understood because it technically is a science. It's a specialty. It's a field of study, universe, which like I don't know. That's something that kind of drives me crazy. Fantasy in general, and this is more of a personal thing. But if you are in a world where magic is technically the leading technology, you're going to have people that dedicate their entire lives to it with all of these very heady, very intelligent ways to describe what it is and how it works. So I kind of like it when fantasy does kind of like ride the line between fantasy and sci-fi in that regard, where there is an explanation for things, but maybe too difficult to understand or really go into over the course of the plot.
I guess if you have a lot of fantasy stories that, like, obviously, if magic existed, like you said, people would study it and, like, dedicate their life to it and actually, you know, have a sort of method for it. So it's like, what's the real difference between sci-fi and fantasy is, like, what's the base of the science, I guess?
Yeah. Yeah, because, like, in a lot of high fantasy, people who dedicate their lives to it are usually people who lock themselves away in towers and these riddles three. Whereas, like, I guess in more sci-fi, it's a more accessible resource to anybody who wants to learn more about it.
I feel like a lot of these discussions are just going to sort of fall to this whole, like, all genres are bullshit kind of like, but that's okay.
I don't disagree with that.
I mean, yeah.
It's really interesting for...
Really care for having the distincts.
Yeah.
I mean, it helps librarians. I would definitely not destroy them, just to look out for them. Like, any people in bookstores, too, like my peeps. We gotta look out for my peeps. But... Misha, it's really interesting too because the magic in your world is also really sciencey. Like, because in Alice in the Nightmare, they have suits and they have to collect dream energy and then they have to store it. And the suits and the collecting and the storing are all very technical looking.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it goes from like, this is a school setting in like a semi, like 1920s setting. And then suddenly it's like, bam, spacesuits.
Yeah. Honestly, it's just like, I just like playing by the no rules, just right, be self-indulgent rules, because that just makes it fun and enjoyable to both write and I would hope read. And yeah, like, it's also, sorry, I'm like currently drinking coffee, so my brain isn't totally turned on. So like, the difference between a hard magic system and a soft magic system, where it's like, you know, like Avatar: The Last Airbender, where it's like, these are the 4 elements that you can bend. You only get one of them, except for this guy who gets all 4. And then like soft magic, which is like, you know, Harry Potter or Lord of the Rings, where it's like, wave your wrist around and say a word and a thing happens, maybe.
I feel the main difference between soft magic and like, I guess hard magic, which is like very sciencey and has very precise sort of like a recipe kind of formula to it. I feel like most soft magic systems are based on willpower.
Mm-hmm.
Like, that's it for namesake. Mm-hmm. Like, namesake, you can do whatever as long as your will is strong enough and your brain can take how weird the universe is. And like, in a lot of stories, it feels a bit like a cop-out. And I'm not going to say that it's not a cop-out in namesake. Like, I'm not going to say that I'm not lazy. I can be both. I can be, like, clever and lazy at the same time. But at the same time, it's kind of interesting because, like, one of them is really technical and the other one is really emotional. Like, in a lot of willpower-based magic systems, like, the hero can just have a really emotional moment and that's how they win.
Mm-hmm.
Like, the bad guy has doubt for 20 seconds and that's how you freaking trounce him. But something I noticed is that the emotional aspect is not entirely out of, like, technical magic. Like, sometimes I'll read a book that has very technical magic, but then the villain has doubt for 20 seconds, so I trounce his ass is also there. Mm-hmm. And I'm thinking about characters like like both Alice and Tissel, which are like the leads of Daughter in the Lilies and Alice in the Nightmare, are both characters that have a lot of doubt, and that doubt like directly affects the magic around them.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's not that interesting otherwise. Like if you have a hard magic system where this happens and this happens, like even the last Airbender, like their bending can be compromised by their emotional state. So like that just makes for an interesting story and for conflict.
Yeah, and I think it reflects reality, because like how often do you find yourself frustrated and yourself up and unable to be productive for that?
You mean like
me.
right now?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, how about that?
Like during this pandemic that I've heard so much about.
Yeah.
No, we're here for escapism.
That's why we're here.
Fantasy, magic.
Reminding us that the real world exists.
Dragons.
Just throw a dragon at the problem.
Yes.
Dragon! Just throw it.
Lightning bolt.
Hot elves.
Please. Don't think about it.
Bring in the twink elves.
Oh,
Make them
gosh.
dance quickly. But yeah, I guess, yeah, it does make it more interesting. I guess what I like too is that both types of magic systems kind of also have this whole like everybody can cook kind of feel to them, but in a completely different way.
Mm-hmm.
Like the recipe one, like anybody could learn this. Not everybody could be great at it, but like everybody could learn it.
Cooking is an art, baking is a science, and where does magic at scale?
Yes.
Oh, I like that. That's good.
Ooh.
Yeah, I guess
Dang.
that's a good question. Oh no, we're getting really abstract. That's definitely
Oh,
throwing.
man. We're gonna need
ends.
like 10 more panels to completely cover this.
I guess what's interesting too, I feel like the whole like science, baking, like everybody can cook aspect to it. In high fantasy, it's sort of easy to express because like magic is sort of omnipresent in a more high fantasy setting. But then when you get to low fantasy, I feel like whenever I'm reading something low fantasy, I feel like the willpower thing kind of goes out the window a little bit. Like it's either very explained or barely explained. Like I'm thinking about stuff like that's kind of an old reference now, but I remember when I was like a teenager. No, I was older than that. I remember when I was in college and reading Twilight at my job at a bookstore, and I wanted to know what the fuss was about. And they just sort of be like, there's vampires, and no explanation, just vampires exist. And there's never like any inquiry of like, but where are you guys from? Like, who made you? Why did you decide to settle? It's like, nope, vampires. Woo.
Can I just
I
say,
have about Twilight, I don't think that was ever one of them.
I actually like unironically love like the power system in Twilight, where it's just like you're a vampire now, so whatever like gift you had as a human, it's now like amplified to the max when you're the supernatural
That's
thing.
actually really cool. Like
I unironically love that.
Like that's a good idea, but there's no lore at all. And then you have stuff like Harry Potter where they literally have like a private school and you have classes
In a
And
government.
a whole history.
Mm-hmm. It just, I feel like in low fantasy, it's either like really not explained at all or it's super detailed. And again, when you go low fantasy, again with the Jumanji example, it's even less explained. It's just cursed game. Cursed game is here. It's the 90s, so it's vaguely African in origin, I guess. Like that vaguely African magical thing in the 90s was definitely the biggest like cop out ever. Oh, that was a fun time. Yay.
Yeah.
Like we're talking about this and I'm wondering how much of an explanation is required or tied in to help people, like basically to help explain the themes or the plot of the work. Like if you have a heavy explanation, I wonder how often like a very complicated message is associated with that.
Complicated you get too, or the more detailed you get, the more you open yourself up for people to point out plot holes.
Mm-hmm.
Oh my god, the people who freaking do giant graphs on the internet of like, oh, in the show I'm watching, if this happened and this means this would be impossible. Plot hole ding, and you're like, man, shut up.
That's
Shut
not a
up.
plot hole. Well, there's also like a general misunderstanding of what plot holes actually are. Like
Oh yeah, tell
plot
me
hole
about
is
it.
like
Tell me about it.
Plot holes are like glaringly obvious, like, but wait, earlier you established that he could do this. Why can't he do that to solve this problem that just came up? Versus, well, technically, so-and-so can do this, so that should mean that they should do this, and then do this, and then do this, and do this, so they do that. You know, like this very long, kind of like nuanced, not as glaring of an error, or something that could just be very easily explained away by something else. Like,
yeah,
I'm
plot hole
not
feels more
explaining
like
this well.
like, you know, they came into the place with a plane, and then the plane is fine, they have access to it, but they go like, we have no means of escape, and you're like, what about your plane?
Yeah. Yeah. As opposed to like trying to find something that doesn't sit with you personally, or like that you would have handled differently if you were writing the story. That's not actually a plot hole.
When you have stuff that people keep calling plot holes, but like it does make sense. Like I'm thinking about the eagles in Lord of the Rings. Like, everybody's like, why did Gandalf just ask to use the eagles? It's like that's
a great example.
It's a big favor to ask a magic eagle. Like, hey, would you mind carrying my friend and his cursed ring across most of the country while everything is trying to kill you?
Yeah. I've also heard a really great theory that like the original pass they wanted to travel through, that they had to turn back and go through the Mines of Moria. Gandalf was technically leading them to meet the eagles or something like that.
Yeah, I heard about that too.
Back for various reasons. Yeah, so it's like that's not actually a plot hole if there are multiple explanations that they don't show you. You know,
like they straight up lost Gandalf at that point. So obviously, any magical means of travel they could have had with Gandalf, like. Why didn't he ask starting at the Hobbit hole? It's like, I don't know, man. Packs with magic birds may be complicated. We don't know.
Hey, man, can you just bring my friend over to, like, downtown?
Come on, man.
I know it's out of your way, but come on.
Yeah.
I know it's really, really dangerous and stupid, but I could really use the favor because I don't actually want to travel with these hobbits.
Hey, I helped you out when you were really little and sick, so now you owe me for life.
Wow.
Swear fealty to me.
Gandalf's kind of a dick in this version. But yeah, the whole like, what's a plot hole? And the other thing that people never get is like fucking setup.
Oh yeah.
It's like 3 weeks ago, I was reading a thing where like there was this guy on YouTube that was doing a stream, and he had an article, and I was reading it and watching the stream, and he was talking about writing, and he was talking about setups, and he was like, oh, you know, I don't remember the example you gave. He gave like this random example of like, oh, if you do this, it's like a setup for the plot, and I'm like, that's not what a setup is. Like it was something random, like, oh yeah, if you put the portrait of his father on like a table, it sets up that he has like father issues, and I'm like, what?
No,
I don't know if I'd agree with that.
I mean, it just can be if you frame it right.
Exists.
Yes.
If he stares at it with, you know, doubt or conflict in his eyes, maybe.
Yeah, maybe. But
if he
it's
turns
just like
it face down on the
background
table, but yeah, like there has to be some level of interaction. If you acknowledge something exists, it exists, but until you show your characters interacting with it, like it doesn't really mean.
Or when some people have the like Game of Thrones type of setup of like, oh, she was mean to like a rapist once, so you know, obviously she's a blood psychopath.
Oh my god.
Those things are exactly the same. Like, exactly the same.
The only Game of Thrones interaction I've ever had is the Lindsay Ellis video essays, and that's all I want.
Yeah, that's all you need.
Yeah.
Game of Thrones
Every
actually has
episode,
a lot of that too, because they keep, at least after they ditched the writer. They did ditch him, like they basically threw him out, but after they got rid of him, they did a lot of digging for like partial setups, and like to essentially try to build random plot devices that they could use to like surprise the audience, and you're just like, man, just tell a good story. Like, it's so weird too that someone would make like a giant spawning random narrative out of something that's just basically based on historical events. Like, it's fine if it's predictable, like it's based on historical events. We could read those events and be like, oh yeah, I guess Jaime's gonna die or whatever, because the prince he's based on fucking kicked it. Because it's the War of the Roses.
You literally have to make it somewhat predictable. You want people to expect a certain, like, number of things to happen. You don't just pull something out of left field and throw it at the audience just to throw a loop. Like, that's not how storytelling works.
Yeah,
you don't just throw it. You don't throw it at them while yelling, "I'm being clever."
Yeah, you don't
Shadowing
get
has a
rewarded
purpose.
for.
Especially in fantasy, because there's no like, there's no framing. Like if you're in low fantasy or just like a day-to-day life thing, you have the framing of the real world to be like, oh yes, this person has these limitations, But in fantasy, like, if you keep changing the rules because you want to be cool and clever, then we can't follow the story anymore,
Yeah.
Because
The audience
you're
a
setting
reasonable
all
idea
the
of what to
rules.
expect.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's something that kind of like drives me crazy watching some anime sometimes, is that it feels like I'm required to take a basic 101 course to understand the later plays, because they keep changing, escalating the stakes to an extent that it requires me to understand like 14 previous seasons of establishment.
You can say
And
Bleach.
I don't
You
know.
can say Bleach. It's fine.
I've actually never watched Bleach for that reason. Because it's like, and with Naruto too, it's just like, man, like to even get invested in this story, I have to do so much work. Like, I don't know.
The worst
To
part
me,
with
that's, like,
Bleach,
too much of an obligation.
like the worst part with works like Bleach is like the first couple books are actually really well constructed. Like the first 12 books of Bleach are great. They're really great. There's like a really specific universe, there's specific powers. It makes sense. And then it's just insane.
Or wanted
Just
to
goes
end
out the
it
window.
and wasn't allowed to.
Yeah, it was successful, so they were contractually obligated in ways to extend the story, which
Time
is something that
to
terrifies
milk it.
me personally as a writer. Like, I do not ever want to deviate from the original vision for the story, just because I don't want it to lose the. Yeah, I don't know. This is like an entire topic. Personally, I've always really loved the beginning of stories more than anything else in the entire world.
But I
Like,
feel
to the
like the
point that, like,
beginning also, like, and again, especially in fantasy stories, beginnings, people have time to really stew them. Like, when the beginning of a story, you think about it constantly. Like, I have the opening chapters of a few stories I want to start that are, like, so clear in my head. Really, like, oh yeah, I spent hours sort of just tooling over them and daydreaming about them. But then as soon as I'm past that point, it's like, oh shit, this is I'm out of the end of the pool I was comfortable in. Now there's sharks. What do I do?
Oh yeah, no, I like beginnings and endings are really like they're usually pretty crystal clear to me because I love like bookending stuff with like what is it, like relating symbolism or like this is how far they've come. And midpoints are also pretty easy, but then like something I'm writing right now where it's like like the middle part, like in the two big in between areas, I'm just like, what do?
Oh
Where
my gosh,
go?
that's where I am right now too. Like middle parts terrify me because oh, I actually have to connect these dots now. Like I have to establish everything so that the end will work. Uh and that's a lot of work and it's all very boring hard work.
How
See
do you
me, I
establish?
have like I always have the arcs really clear, like the end of each arc. Like I have my first chapter really clear. I have like, okay, at arc 1 I want the character to be like this, arc 2 I want the character to be like this, arc 3 I want the character to be like this. But then I never figure out the ending and or how to get to these points. Like for namesake, I'm like, oh, arc 1 Emma has to learn she's a skeleton key. Arc 2 she has to get her own personal sword. Arc 3 something else happens and I'm not gonna say because that would be like a huge spoiler. And people are like, how's it gonna end? And I'm like, I don't know, I have Megan for that.
God, we all need a Megan.
That's Megan's job.
Trouble with like the middle of a story. It's more just a matter of like I have like 12 different scenes that I have planned out and like the pages in between them where I reestablish where I am, those are what's hard.
Oh,
The stuff that I've already planned.
well, like something else too, and is something I keep forgetting. People are really smart. Uh, so you
Those
can think you're being really
bastards.
clever and like I know, right? People like you think you're being really smart and just completely burying like a little detail that nobody realizes is gonna. And then like not even 24 hours has passed since that page goes up, and people already like basically predicted it, but you can't confirm it and are basically having an existential crisis as a writer in private because you like feel like you're the most predictable person in the world. Um, but at the
Foreshadowing
same time,
skills.
foreshadowing skill. So
I mean,
people's
it doesn't really
oh
matter if you're predictable either. Like it's not, you know, it's not the destination, it's the journey. You know, it's like
yeah, yeah.
you know, Snape kills Dumbledore, but like the question is, but how?
Yes, and why?
Yeah,
Why?
like I think I'm weird for this, but like I will absolutely like look up the Wikipedia article of a movie I want to see
Oh
and
my
read the
god,
whole plot,
same.
and I
I do
still want
that
to go see
too.
it.
I
I
also
am
do
reaching.
that.
I am reaching through the screen and grabbing your hand because absolutely,
Do we all do that?
it's like
I like to know
I
what to expect so I can look up and like notice the details as they happen.
like I have
Like I enjoy it the
absolutely
second time I watch it more than the first.
yeah, same. Like I have explained this to people as like I am like spoiler immune because it's just like if I know a spoiler, it doesn't really matter to me because it's so like I my disbelief is like so weak that it's just like the music will get me and like the emotional journey will get me and it's just like I know everything that's gonna happen, but I am so wrapped up in the drama and the drama conflama that I love this.
And
Man,
if the
I'm the
spoiler
opposite.
ruins
I'm
the
like
movie or the
so
book,
spoiler
like
sensitive.
that's weak writing.
Yeah, there's just so much more to a story than just the events. And I feel a lot of people focus on that. People are like, "Oh, I have to be original, I have to be different." Like, and it's like, yeah, but it's the packaging, you know, it's not like at the end of the day, every story has been told. And you know, a lot of people joke that Namesake is just Tsubasa, like, but European. And I'm like, yeah. Like at some point everything has been done, and it's really like how you perform the you know, how you perform the story. Like a lot of people, I remember when Hunger Games came out, and I actually really like the Hunger Games. Like I will
Oh,
die,
same.
I will die on this hill, I don't care. A lot of people were like, ooh, it's just battle royale, and I'm like, okay, but
No, it's not.
it's not.
It is not battle royale at all.
Like, yeah, I get same base concept, children fighting in a ring. Like, okay, but that's not new either. Like, you know, Lord of the
That's
Flies
like,
has been
yeah.
here too.
And isn't it
And same
based
with
on like
Thunderdome.
yeah, isn't it based on like the labyrinth and like the story of the Minotaur where like or what is it, Athens had to sacrifice a lot of their use to go into the labyrinth and be eaten by this monster.
Yeah, and they even have another YA thing that's inspired by the same thing that's literally called the labyrinth. Like, at some point, the events don't matter. Like, everybody has a freaking coffee shop AU, you know? Like, it's
because
fun.
They're cute.
Because it's great. The events do not matter. It's kind of like when you read shoujo manga and like from the 90s and all of them end with a plot that's like, I have to go to another country for school. I guess we won't see each other again. But then they meet in some way and you're like, yeah. And you're like, obviously, come on. Like, obviously this will occur and also this will be resolved, but it doesn't matter. What matters is like the journey to get there. Like, does my heart swell as I'm consuming this content? Then we're fine. It doesn't matter if it's stupid. Like, you're giving me emotions and it's fine. So
do I cry every time I watch the Sailor Moon Power of Love thing where they're on like the meteor falling to Earth and they're all supporting Usagi? Yes.
Goddamn yes, I do. Like, and even stuff like Steven Universe, which everybody's like, it's the most original show in the world. It's not. A lot of the plot points are derived from other things. Like, a lot of it's just Sailor Moon crossed with Dragon Ball. And that's, like, freaking rad. Like, it doesn't matter. It literally doesn't matter. What matters is, like, that I'm responding to this. Like, so when people get really hung up on, like, isn't this kind of like that? It's like, yeah, it is, because all fantasy works have been done before, and everybody's writing fantasy. Like, everybody on the planet is writing fantasy. So maybe get off my dick.
Because it's fun. Let me live. How'd you get in my house?
Yeah, who invited you, punk? Get out.
Just like, I love that because the value of a work is determined by the person assigning value to it, like the person reading and stuff. It kind of like gets back to the power of the readers and stuff. Like,
yeah, but that's also why I don't like, you know, when people, I mean, it's not true. I do like watching them. You know, when you have YouTube channels where people just like crap on a bad book. Like, I like watching those because it's funny. Well, I like the ones that are funny, not the ones that are mean. Like when someone actually sort of weirdly enjoyed the ride, even though it was not very good, but they were like, you know, I was entertained for 5 hours and I now have the material to make jokes. You're like, yeah, that's fun.
I will still watch those Read with Cindy videos where she just destroys the A Court of Thorns and Roses books because they're just fun.
She's not really destroying it. She's like, it's bad, but also here's 1,000 dick jokes. Like, she's building on it. It's fun.
Yeah,
it's fun.
As opposed to like similar YouTube channels, but that are completely different, that completely tear apart TV shows and movies, and not in a way that's constructive. Like if you walk away with the conclusion that, oh, this thing is bad and so is everybody who worked on it, not a good channel to be watching.
You can say cinema sins. It's fine. You can say cinema sins. But yeah,
basically, anybody who makes a show about a TV show is hard for me to watch because it feels like they're not working with all the information to a decision. But I'm very biased when it comes to stuff like that.
It just boils down to like, this work is good if it gives me like emotions and it's great, and if it gave you like no emotions or bad emotions, then it didn't work for you. My mom was a librarian. She's retired now. She's not like dead.
Phew.
She was a librarian, and she would always say like, there is no bad readers. There's just people who haven't found the right book yet. Like
solid.
Yeah, she believed that everybody had a one true book. And when we were kids, we would read like a ton of comics, and a lot of people would go up to my mom and she's like, aren't you worried that your kids won't read real books? And she was like, first of all, what? Second of all, they're reading. Like, does it matter what they're reading as long as they're reading? Like, if you have a child and their big trip is reading everything on Wikipedia, why is this a negative? Like,
Yeah.
she got so mad at people. Or when people would go up to her and be like, fantasy and sci-fi are not real genres and you shouldn't, like, encourage your children to read it. She's like, oh, I'm sorry, is your child reading? Like, she would be like...
You should only read textbooks.
Only boring shit. Like, so it's sort of this idea. And I think that's, like, something that works like Harry Potter have also... Like, for all the current modern problematic aspects to it, they really embodied this whole, like, there's no good or bad genre. Fantasy is not lesser. And there's no, like, people who are not readers. Everybody's a reader. Deep down, because you just have to find that book you fall in love with. That book that is easier enough for your brain to read. Like, I still can't read adult level English books because English is my second language. Like, I read adult level French books and then English YA, you know? Because whenever I try to read, like, I actually tried to read the book that the movie Annihilation was based on, and it was too hard for me, so I bought the French version and I read that. And, like, thank God for translations, honestly. But, like, you know, in English I can't read super complex stuff because I get really tired really fast, and then it's work, and then I'm not interested. So, you know, there's a lot of books in English that don't interest me. And doesn't, like, the book could be excellent or the book could be like a pile of crap, but it doesn't matter because it's not connecting with me, you know?
Mm-hmm.
That's the thing that matters. It's the connection. It's always a connection. And I think that's why fantasy is such a big genre, because it's so easy to create a world that, like, emotionally resonates with you when you can build it piece by piece.
For sure.
Mm-hmm.
Like, and then also, like, fantasy leaves so much room for interpretation. Like, tying into what we were just talking about, it's so much easier for people to have a visceral reaction to something when they're allowed to interpret it in the ways that they...
I'm just kind of thinking about, like, Leonard Nimoy singing about Bilbo Baggins, and I'm like, that's the feeling. That's the feeling.
Yeah.
That's the feeling you want forever. We actually have a question in the stream chat that we're almost done. So I'm going to toss in this question so we can sort of answer that before we run out of time. Mm-hmm. So someone asked, how many projects are you working on at one time, like projects you have stewing?
Ooh. How many fingers do I have? Let's see.
That's enough of an answer, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I probably have about 20 general ideas for works that I could get to. But in terms of stuff that I've worked on enough that I'm confident I could start it tomorrow, there's maybe like 3 of them.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Like, they have different levels. Like, I've got the ideas right now that I have that are definitely like the most fleshed out. There's Namesake, which is ongoing. Yay, I figured it out. I've got a short comic that I sort of know what I want to do about a mermaid that I want to sort of start on Patreon. I've got 2 other works that I kind of have the first chapter figured out, but not the rest. So I could start, but it's not what I'd call well constructed. I've got my graphic novel that is mostly like ready to go, that I'm trying to pitch to publishers right now, so that's good. Well, I mean, that's on pause now because, you know.
Life.
Yes, life.
All that junk. And I'm sort of working on a story an adaptation of King Arthur, where I sort of know what I want to do and what characters I want to use, but not at all, like, graphically how I want to do it, or, you know, how I want to sort of disseminate it into the world. So it's like different levels. Like, I have some that I barely have any story, but the characters are done and the graphics are done, and I could go and just make up the rest as I go. And I have others that are like, I've got a lot of story, but I don't have any of the, like, visuals figured out, and those are a bit harder to start.
Mm-hmm.
That's the case for, like, the graphic novel, the Arthur one. Like, the whole story is sort of hammered out, but the visuals still need a lot of work, and since it's a comic, that's kind of a big part of it. I don't know about you guys, what you got going.
I mean,
too many things.
Yeah,
I've got at least like 2 that have not even like started officially working on. And then I've got like 1 I'm currently releasing on Patreon, and then also working on like TQ and Far to the North. Like, I'm not really touching Far to the North right now, but like I try to not think of new stories because I should be focusing on the ones I already have.
At the same time, I think it's a good exercise to maybe stretch your places because burnout on a possible.
Yeah, burnout on a project is kind of
it's also a total, yeah, it's also a total siren song to like think about a different project you want to start, but at the same time, it can also potentially solve a problem at work. Sorry.
No. Like a good exercise is when you get inspired to do something that you're not already working on, is to see how you could incorporate that specific thing into what you are already working on. And it helps motivate you to work on that and to stick to that.
Yes.
I mean, in your case, Misha, you already have like a list of stories. I know, I've seen.
Oh, yeah.
I've seen.
Oh, yeah. No, I have. I have like, I think. Well, I have Alice, which I'm always working on. Is definitely like the most fleshed out of anything. But then there's another thing that I started working on fairly recently that is like definitely developed a lot more quickly, which I'm really happy about. And then otherwise, I just have like a couple others that are simmering in the back of my mind. One that like I've had to do some major retooling, but it's a lot of it is just like I don't know where I would find a home for them, more or less. It's like, would this be a comic? Would this be a story? It's a thing to figure out on its own.
You know, a lot of people actually tell me like, "Oh, this one story you're doing, you should make it into a prose novel instead." And I'm like, "In English?" Can I give up preemptively, please? And everybody's like, "No, you'd be a great writer," and I'm like, disagree. I've seen the essays I wrote for English class, and yeah, my assessment
French.
my assessment of Animal Farm was poor. Oh, I can't write in French either, though.
Oh, well, that too. Like the downside of being an artist who is told to, you should look into writing it. It'll never match the image you have in your head. It's just easier to draw it out and just show people that.
Yeah, it's like, you know what matches the image into my head? The image I draw.
Here it is. See?
I've been trained to show, not tell. What do I do with this?
Yeah, it's so weird. And I still, like, for a lot of stuff, I do that too. Like, when people are like, "Oh, what do you mean?" And I'm like, let me just grab a piece of paper, I'll draw it. Like, when I'm just explaining a random thing, it's like, hang on. So it's like this. And I draw it, and people are like, "Oh." And I'm like, okay, so I wasted 10 minutes of words and, like, 20 seconds on a doodle.
Yep. That happens all the time in the animation industry, too. Like, there's so many things I've with directors that they're trying to describe something for me, and then they go, "Hold on," and then they pull up YouTube and type in whatever clip they're thinking about from a different movie, and then just make me watch that, and are like that, make it like that. So it's hard to go from, that power of communication to trying to elicit the exact same emotions purely through written language.
Yeah, like, honestly, I feel like prose has a weird reputation because everybody's like, "Oh, I'm gonna write a book," like it's the easiest thing in the world, and then you feel bad for actual writers because then you're like, "God, I'm so sorry."
Oh man, there's so many writers that like it feels like I'm reading a painting because their mastery of prose is just so beautiful, and it's like, man, like I just want to enjoy this. Like,
yeah,
I
no,
don't
the
wanna...
thing like I grew up really wanting to like be a writer and like write stuff, and so I always have that like recently rediscovering that little like kernel of inspiration, and it's been really fun to reconnect. But the thing that made me want to do it was like listening to the Night Circus audiobook, where like everything is just described in like beautiful like scents and colors and everything, and I'm just like, I want to live this world. This sounds amazing.
I could definitely see the motivation also, like, for comic artists to want to really stretch their wings, prose writing, because it does rewire your brain a little bit, and it's fun to add that to your, like, sort of creative bow. It's also fun to create a book that people, you know, take more than 20 minutes to read.
Your entire life's work in 5 minutes. Oh, great, thanks.
Oh, yeah.
Your comic in like 3 hours.
You know, that's a weird thing, too, because at Comic-Con, sometimes people buy, like, the first book of Namesake, and then they go like, oh, yeah, I read it last night in, like, an hour, so I'm back to buy the second one the next day, and a part of me is, like, really flattered, but another part of me is like, an hour, huh? A single hour. That's cool. That's fine.
Dope, dude.
So I just choose to focus on the other part, like the whole like, oh, cool, you came back, like, because that's awesome. But I mean, I also blast through comics and novels really fast, but then I reread them a lot. So I'm assuming that other people do that too. Like,
much easier to reread a comic.
Yeah,
I try to like jam pack all of my with like little details in the background that like help for the review. Because you know, you want to get as much mileage out of a book as possible.
Yeah, you want
Totally.
that reread value. An hour, huh? Cool.
Wasn't the stream about fantasy?
We're all fantasy writers, and now we devolved into like our personal fantasy of becoming better writers.
Full circle, baby.
Yeah,
There you
but
go.
I think this is also like, I feel like the whole like, oh, comic to prose thing is also something that, you know, they throw at fantasy writers a lot, because they're like, oh, both these things are like creative and for children, right? And you're just like, okay. That happens a lot. This whole like that comics and fantasy stuff and D&D is like for children mood is so weird. I remember I worked in a bookstore that had a giant comic department, because we were like the only supplier in our region for like a lot of these, and we would sell to schools and stuff. And the library also had a youth section, so, you know, baby to oldest YA, so anything that fits for like children, teenagers, etc. And then the final section in the front was like the adult literature, so poetry, books for like actual full-grown humans, books that weren't fiction, textbooks, all that stuff. And what annoyed me the most is each department had about 20 employees, and the front had about 30 if you count like all the cash people, because they would do like the cash and the general administration on top of doing like the book stuff. And those 30 people treated the other 40, like the two other departments, comics and youth, like we were children.
Oh my god.
Like, there was really this whole, like, because you love these and you read these voluntarily, because we had to read all the books just to keep up, you know, either way, whether you wanted to or not, you were doing a lot of reading. Because if you have schools that come in, they're like, what's new that you can recommend, and you don't know what the fuck is happening in these books, how do you recommend anything? And they expect you to do this work, they really do. But they just treated all of us like kids, because I remember one time I was, like, reading a novel, and it was like, and this person from the front came into the break room and it's like, oh, you're not reading a comic, that's different. And I'm like, yeah, it's Isaac Asimov. And it's like, oh, fantasy? Well, that's not really far then. It's like, man, what the
Isaac
fuck?
Asimov?
Yeah.
Manga.
Wait.
Isaac Asimov,
Wait.
books for children, you know?
Wait.
Yeah, it's so weird. Like, even the classics of fantasy and sci-fi just got a really bad rap. And I guess that's an interesting point to close on. Then we can sort of just like tear into that next time. Why the bad reputation and what is the actual appeal? Because that's a thing too. It's a genre that has a bad
just
reputation,
because they're
but the best sellers too.
A reputation because all these people read fantasy books when they were kids and then refused to read them once they got older, so they don't actually know any fantasy that isn't for kids.
I mean, there's definitely the basic bitch Karen argument, that's for sure. We are out of time though.
Dang, already.
I know, these are really fast.
They're fun though.
There's too much to talk about. Yeah, so thanks everybody for joining in. As always, these are recorded and they will be put on YouTube in a couple of hours. And as I said at the opening, we have another stream that's going to happen at 2:30. That is an interview with the artist of Folklore. And you can also clue in tomorrow. We have 2 other panels. One about reading suggestions for comics, reading recommendations at 1 o'clock, and an interview with the creator of RPG at 2:30. So join in, like,
She's great.
Yeah, stay on this.
You should go to
stay
that.
on the stream. Come back tomorrow for those, because they're great people. They're amazing. Brienne is hilarious, so definitely worth listening to. We weren't sure last time we did streams that these would be a regular thing, but I think, now we can definitely say that these are going to be a regular thing. So definitely subscribe to the channel if you're on Twitch, or subscribe to our YouTube page if you're watching this on YouTube. That way you get notifications when we're doing these. And obviously follow us on Twitter. That is the best way to get notifications about absolutely everything, including our new comics and all that stuff. And just wanted to note, since we're talking about fantasy, one of our fantasy comics that is beautiful just started its 5th chapter, which is the next to last chapter to the graphic novel. So Kochab, please read Kochab. It is so good and amazing. And if you like fantasy and you like fantasy that's a bit outside of the box, it's definitely something you want to look at. It is gorgeous. It's got slightly animated pages. It's about a girl who meets a fire spirit in an abandoned home. It's just beautiful, and it's gay. It's so gay. Please read the fantasy gay. Does anybody have like closing things they want to say before we stop?
Thanks for having me.
Oh man,
Oh, thank you.
always.
Thank you.
You guys are amazing. I love talking to you so much.
Same.
All right. Well, thanks for joining us. Have a great day, everybody.
Thank you.
Have a great day.
Hello, hello. Can everyone hear me?
Yeah, can hear you loud.
Yeah.
What about everyone in the chat? Can they hear us? Thank you. I'm trying to pull this up. Oh, perfect. Thank you, everybody. For our little sound check thing that we're going to start with, Adam and Colin, What'd you have for breakfast today?
I had coffee.
Today was a late start, so sushi.
Sushi? You had sushi for breakfast?
That's
Well,
you're a fancy
like
boy.
I woke up at like 12, so
So it's like sushi for lunch.
yeah. Well, it's the breakfast is the first meal of the day, so it's still breakfast.
True.
That's how it works.
Yeah, that's how I calculate it.
Perfect. That is absolutely perfect. Let me
I'm hungry.
let me share a tweet. Ooh, Adam, you already tweeted. You're ahead of the
I was
game.
ready.
Yeah,
I was ready.
You're absolutely on it.
You had a finger on the trigger the entire time.
It's how I live my life.
He's been waiting all week for that.
I don't have any peanut butter cups, Brush Bandit.
So, if this is the case,
Nari roll.
3, 2, 1, and we're good. Hey everyone, how y'all doing? How'd you like the panel? That was really good. Like, I really liked when they got really deep into high fantasy versus urban fantasy. That's something that I had not really thought a lot about. It was really fun.
Man, that was a really fun panel. I like when they started talking about Bleach and Naruto.
Yeah. Like, man, you can learn a lot about someone when you start talking to them about Bleach.
It's a pretty revealing conversation.
Yeah, it is.
I find that most people prefer the first arc.
Yeah.
Over everything that happens afterward.
Yeah, it's like how deep do they go? Like, it tells you something about them.
For good reason.
I only finished Bleach out of obligation. I was already in too deep.
Yeah, I've definitely heard some people do that, like where it's like an addiction at that point. We're like, well, gotta finish it. Well, let's get started then. So this is going to be a bit of an interview. If you've never heard of Folklore before, if you've never heard of either Adam or Colin, you're going to get to learn about them and learn about the great comic that they make. So to help everyone who might not know you, can you two introduce yourselves?
Yes. I'm Adam Ma, the writer / co-creator of Folklore.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, I'm Colin Tan. Yeah, and I illustrate Folklore.
Well, and this is really interesting because like a lot of comics on Hive or on other comics that I see, typically they have like one creator or a creator and they hire a colorist or they work with teams in a different kind of way. And you two are very much like collaborators together when it comes to building Folklore, but each of you have individual things that you bring into it that I really want to like dig into and start asking questions about because it's super interesting to me from the outside. Because both of you are working on this, I'm sure as you wander around, as you do things, people will ask you like, oh, what's Folklore? How do each of you pitch it to other people or like talk to other people about it?
So we received a I guess the review or an impression of Folklore from someone. I forget their name. I'm so sorry, but this one really stuck with me, and it was The Incredibles meets The Walking Dead.
Oh, that's a good way to say it.
Yeah. So, I mean, obviously, Adam and I have when we're at cons, we have a more in-depth pitch, I guess, to tell someone if they don't know what Folklore is, to tell them what the premise is without any spoilers. But yeah, it's pretty much The Incredibles meets The Walking Dead.
That's a really good start. And Adam, what do you say?
Yeah, at a con, it's a lot of it is like casting out align with like with like a specified lore. So like Incredibles meets The Walking Dead has always been like my favorite tagline that we've kind of received from reviews. I usually just start by saying it's a superhuman horror story. Um, and I know like the ideal elevator pitch is like a sentence or two that really gets you into it, but it doesn't usually take us very long to like start going really in depth into the plot anytime we're talking with someone about like what the background of folklore is and what our lore is and how it works. It's at its core, it's just superhuman horror, and that's like the groundwork, I guess, to ease someone into a very long-winded explanation that comes after.
Yeah, extremely long-winded.
Well, like, that's one of the things that I really appreciated about reading through Folklore was that both of you worked very hard. I could see both in the art and the writing to try to ground these characters, and not in a way that is necessarily nihilistic or pessimistic, but when you're introduced to one of the main characters, Helios, you learn about, like, it's very much, you're trying to capture a feel about him that he is, I don't know if relatable is the right term, but very much a person. Like, you can see how he's, I mean, the very beginning of the story starts, like you say, with some horror elements, with like atmosphere building. And when you meet Helios, that is such an interesting thing. Sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself, but you've managed to build an atmosphere where you can have superhumans in it, but you're still scared. There's still something to be worried about. Where if Superman shows up in a comic sometimes, you usually feel relief, or you feel like tension is gone. Is that something that you had to really like work on or like really worry about when you started this story?
Yeah, definitely was. I mean, the idea was always that when a superhero shows up, you're usually like, oh, the day is saved, or you get ready for like like a DC slash Marvel, like a showdown. Like a
Yeah.
superhero shows up, they're there to meet a villain, and then they're there to like duel or duke it out. But here, the superhero shows up, and you know that they're not really a hero anymore, or even if they were a villain, they're not really the same kind of villain that they were. And when I first started working on Folklore, the original idea, like the very, very first like few sentence pitches to Colin, was actually about the plot that's going on right now with Quietus. Quietus, this whole arc, issues 4, 5, and 6, was originally the start of Folklore, and we realized partway through writing what was then issue 1, now issue 4, that we needed to explain more, that like there wasn't enough about the world or the characters, so we paused, and then we created what is now issues 1, 2, and 3 to help kind of ease into the world and the characters and why things have gone the way they are.
Yeah. And like the building that world, I can see that both of you worked hard to, I mean, we'll get into this a little bit later, but the ways in which you have let people have multiple access points into this story to learn bits in different formats that I think work really well for what you do, is really fascinating. I'm going to turn on a slideshow for everyone so that everyone can start seeing some pages and some images from Folklore. And we may comment on them as they flip through. We may not, but this is so that everyone can sort of get an understanding of when we talk about superhuman horror, which there is some history of from my vague memories, but it's not something that people say. It's not like it's not a common category at a library or a bookstore, but it's really interesting. It's a really, really fun thing. Can you tell me, both of you, Adam and Colin, what inspired you to tell this story together?
So Adam approached me beforehand we had been working together as an editorial team on a gaming website,
Oh, interesting.
and yeah, so Adam approached me with his comic pitch for folklore, and what we were talking about building that atmosphere, about having that feeling of when a superhero shows up, and not having that sense of relief, but rather a sense of fear and uncertainty. That was sort of the reason why I jumped on board, because his writing just built that world up, and I could see it clearly.
That's awesome. Adam, can you talk a little bit about what inspired you and what's like? How long did this idea? How long was this idea sitting in you before you started talking with Colin about it?
I actually started. I mean, it's a long time now, but I didn't actually think too much about making a horror comic until shortly after the original release of the Marvel Zombies run.
Oh
Um,
yeah,
yeah, it was kind of a cool idea. Like it was playing into like zombie fever was like at its highest. Like Walking Dead was out,
yeah.
the show was doing okay. Like everyone was trying to get like some part of the zombie action. There was like a million zombie games that were coming out. And so Marvel did their Marvel Zombies run, which the TLDR behind that is that superheroes turn into zombies and then they start murdering each other and spreading the zombie plague. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and I thought like that's it's a cool idea, but like I wish it was scary.
Yeah.
And like I wish like there was a reason to be like more afraid of heroes would or could be scarier than just like obviously imposing or just obviously, you know, we're told to be afraid of them because they've got a skull instead of a face. And that kind of is what folklore was spun from, was just kind of a little disappointment from that specific comic release.
Yeah, and I mean, even I didn't read the whole run, but even from the beginning, it very much was positioned like a standard what if story from Marvel, where
Yeah.
there's a little bit of like tongue in cheekness, there's a little bit of like comedy, sort of Deadpool angle of like, isn't this an interesting idea? Isn't this a little strange? But and I remember some panels from it being pretty like intense for some people, but overall the tone was like, wouldn't it be weird if Hulk was a zombie?
Yeah.
Versus trying to ground that in how terrified you'd be if you saw someone that you'd respected turn into something like that. And without spoiling, I do think, speaking of what I just said, in the very beginning of Folklore, there is a character that feels a bit like there's some sympathy to that character. And I think you might know who I'm talking about. Like, it's not Helios. And you provide some sort of grounding of like this character, this hero that you've seen being twisted in some way. You have sympathy for them at the same time, but you're terrified of them. And I think that's right away, you two do such a great job of that. In the chat, I am going to post, if you type !folklore, you'll see links for everyone, the comic, and the @ symbols are for everyone's Twitter handles. I will also repeat this at the end. So you can see both Adam and Colin. And speaking of both of you, when you work on this together, like when you build an arc, when you build a page, how do you two start? Like, how do you two start the process?
It usually starts from Adam's script. What we usually do is we do a script breakdown before we start on any page,
Mm-hmm.
and we just read through it together.
And what does that script look like? Is it just like an outline, or is it like a movie script or a teleplay script where you have individual like dialogue bits?
It's a little more it's kind of more teleplay with a little cinematic description in there. There's dialogue bits and facing blocking for every single character. So I usually set the perspective, and then I'll say who each character is talking to, even if that other character is off panel or if they're not seen at all. So if it's like a dead-on shot of Helios talking, I'll still say who he's talking to, which I think helps ground the scene a little bit more, so that like his eyes are always going to be going into a very specific direction based on where the positions of the characters were in the last panel. And then we break it down panel by panel. So sometimes I'll make a page that is rarely I will make a page that is spot on, where it's like 4 panels perfect done. A lot of the times we'll read it and we'll decide, oh, okay, you know, maybe this needs to be 3 panels. Maybe the action here could actually be 6 panels, and we just cut it up into smaller bits of movement. But usually we'll go page by page, and there will always be some sort of adjustment that needs to be made for the clarity of the reader.
Interesting.
And
Yeah,
then
yeah.
Going on from that after, like the editing and the adjustments don't just end at the script. Because after that I'll start doing thumbnails for all the pages, layouts, and more often than not I'll find that okay, maybe the adjustments that we had made in the script read through aren't quite working, and then we'll make adjustments accordingly at the thumbnail layout stage.
And then as you are doing that, like as you make those adjustments, do you does this process, does it feel like you've started, because you've been working on this for a bit, does it feel like you two have like a good rhythm set?
Yeah, I definitely say so. Like we're at a point now where it used to take us like around a year to make one issue, just figuring out like what things should look like, or even like the tone of the world. Like it takes a lot to figure out like what the world of does this individual character need to look like, or what does this action scene need to look like. And then it's a different type of work, but it's not nearly as strenuous as it used to be.
Good. And like, so at the very beginning, you had to do a ton of concept work to sort of build a consistent visual language, right?
Yeah, I had been doing a bunch of concept art just to figure out like, you know, we had different eras that we settled on. Like we had the golden age of heroes where, you know, peace was great, and you know, what does that look like? And we had figured as a nice contrast between our current timeline and the past, that the past would be much more saturated with color. You know, it just feels a bit more hopeful. And now, not to say that we desaturated the look, because I don't think it's that desaturated. But the color palette is definitely a lot more darker.
Yeah, like when I see the images, I mean, just from my memory of reading through the pages, when you talk about the Age of Heroes before the story begins, there are purples in both, but the purples in like the image you see now, the values are a lot, like you said, darker. And I don't think, yeah, I agree with you that I don't think saturated. It doesn't feel muddy. But it does feel harsher. Like it feels like, you know, you see a lot of scenes like this scene right here where there's still daylight, but it feels like empty. Like the city that they're in exploring in this part feels like hollow, like it's been bored out. And here in this interior scene, you see you still have a lot of light sources coming in, but you see like green on their faces. You've done a lot to keep this from feeling too, like the tone that you're going for is not like a gothic horror. So you're not giving them sort of like Hellboy shadows. And
yeah, as much as I would love to give them Hellboy shadows, because on a production level, that would be so much not say easier, but definitely Because even just figuring that out is a whole other story.
Well, yeah, like it is interesting because I love hearing about concept work and trying to figure out what is the right tone that we're going for. Like as a designer at Hive and other places, like I like helping to build a particular visual language. So when I designed your site, I was trying to make sure that I was not contradicting the like tech language that you have, the way that technology works in this future that you have. Because you've said it, is this on Earth or like an alternate Earth?
It's on Earth, but the timeline is slightly adjusted.
Okay. So like they had Die Hard the movie, but it's like slightly in the
Probably.
future. Okay.
We actually talk about this a lot, like in terms of having pop culture references and like serials and stuff. Like I think we're always gonna lean away from like saying that like a band or an artist or something like that exists. But there may be times where like someone will make a reference to like a brand as a company or something like that.
Yeah, like I've already detected from what I've read that there is some corporate like structures that existed before everything went to crap. But there's not and not that there's a ton of time for people to just like meander and talk, because there's a lot of stuff that happens, which I want to talk about that later too. But no one's like, hey, what was your favorite band? Like those kind of conversations don't really come up. And I think that gives it a sort of, I don't know if timeless is the right word, but I think it removes it from discussions of like Garfield or something, like.
Well, it's like there's actually an element of fantasy. This is what kind of makes folklore hard to pin down as a genre in terms of like us pitching it as well, because there is a common trope that happens in post-apocalyptic media where at some point the survivors sit down and they talk about the things that they missed, and it's always like, oh, I love this brand, or I like this type of food, or this restaurant, or this play or musical or something like that, and they can bond over that. But because we're trying to create like a unique world lore, we lose a lot of those little character moments, or the potential for those little character moments, if we don't work really hard to establish like a firm lore in the background. So I think I think we might have referenced Benadryl, but like in talking about something that the reader already knows about, you can connect with them so much easier than having to re-explain a brand new type of allergy medication that they can then correlate with like a real world problem. So like we always have to be very careful in terms of what it is that the reader can empathize with in terms of comforts. And that's something that fantasy books like and movies do really well. Like people can understand what it is to be around a fire together, or to have warmth, or to be in a hearth. Like they may have never had mead before, but they understand like, oh, that's a comforting thing. We have to find modern day ways of relaying that sort of comfort without having to lean on the fact that like partway through a shot they drink a can of Coca-Cola in an abandoned warehouse.
Yeah, and like I think that some properties like I Am Legend and other sorts of post-apocalyptic stuff, they can lean really hard into the ephemera. Like even Wall-E sort of made their own brands to do this. The thought of walking around discarded, Coke cans and things like that. And the flavor that you two have brought to folklore is like you have a lot of characters who and I don't mean this as a pejorative, but like they're archetypal, and I think that has the strength of like, you have a journalist who is understandably very mad about a lot of things, and you can ping them off of characters like Helios, who is the one with the beard that you see in these images. And I think that that has a strength there. But the way they relate is more like on a fundamental level, or more like what you're talking about with Hearths and Mead, a like person to person level. And I think that gives this, rather than a bunch of people, like we were saying, like rather than a bunch of people comparing what their favorite bands were before the end of the world, there's a lot of like very meaningful connections that happen very quickly in this comic. Is that on purpose?
Yeah, when I think about this kind of relates to like the corporate discussion earlier. When I think about people connecting to one another, I think about I haven't read the book because I don't want to depress myself, but the movie The Road.
Oh wow.
There's that sequence with the dad and the son, and they're constantly finding like corporate things from the past, and every time they find it, it's a relief. Like finding cereal with weird names, or like candy that used to exist. Like the boy finds this stuff and constantly just wants to relive it, and it's always a place of comfort for the dad. But there's that scene where they sit and they drink a soda together, and it's like the Coke can that they're holding is like venerated, like it's this holy relic from this bygone era. And it's cool, but I want that without the logo. I don't want to show that anymore. Like I don't think we need to obsess over that, because the whole point is that like part of that is the broken system that Helios was a part of. So we don't need to worship that anymore. We just need to focus on the characters, and that's where these character archetypes come in, where like they're very much like, oh, I see, there's the journalist, the soldier, the kid, the grizzled veteran. They have things to interact with each other that don't involve products.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the strengths of having archetypal characters, in my opinion, is that you can dive beyond the like surface layer of things, and try to hit something that is like, I feel very much that Folklore is a kind of story that you could translate to a lot of other languages, and probably there's like bits that would not make sense. There's bits that you'd have to smooth over because translators do a hard ass job. And but I do think that there's something that can be approached from many different angles from this, and I feel like Folklore is a story that you could come back to years from now and still find something in, which doesn't mean other kinds of stories are weaker, but that is definitely a strength that I've caught from Folklore. When it comes to the kinds of characters, the kinds of like, since we're using the term archetypes, do you Adam, as the writer, did you very intentionally set up what kind of archetypes, like what kind of characters come in first?
One character or another to get a little bit more spotlight in terms of like character development. And one of the first things that was really important to me, which we hear this a lot, is Diana and Helios. Everyone hates Diana. She's a huge bitch.
Who is Diana again?
He previously was one of the few journalists who wasn't necessarily against the former government, but was extremely critical of the shape that the former government was taking. And she is unapologetically angry, like furious over the fact that she was maybe not the most polite or nicest person, but that she does have a good heart. She's just sort of kind of insufferable about it. Was really important, because her relationship with Helios is always going to be the other side of the conversation. It's very easy to just look at heroes and then constantly see the heroic things that they do and just treat them as being incredible. But Diana is there as the other side of the coin, who says you're not always right. You historically speaking, destroyed our world. So maybe let's take another look at things.
Well, I think that's really fascinating, because like you say, it is so easy to see, especially in this story, Helios as a source of comfort, as a protagonist that you want to rally around, and to try to poke a hole in that. Adam, do you want to do this, or would you like me to?
You know what? I would be interested to hear your perspective to see if we did a
Okay.
good job.
So, and you get this very quickly when you read the story. I believe it happens within the first 3 pages. Like, Adam and Colin do a really good job of being like, bam, bam, bam. Here's what you need to know. Now let's go. And these heroes start congregating, and then as more of them appear, supervillains also started to appear. Then they started to form factions. When these factions started to war, things got way out of hand and way more chaotic. People eventually had to like flee city centers because of how bad this was getting. They eventually develop a technology that allows them to stop these powers, like turn off people's powers. But the unfortunate side effect is that a lot of times it kills them and it makes their powers go haywire. They put it into a bomb called the Ark, and when it blows up in the atmosphere, which they call the dusting, when this dusting happens across the planet, some superheroes' powers go completely chaotic. Some of them just die straight up. And it ruins the planet in a way. And now these survivors, who Diana, who you see in the blue vest right here, is one of, are trying to survive. And instead of there being zombies or whatever other kind of post-apocalyptic setup you have some people whose powers have gone haywire. You have people whose superpowers have just turned off, all over the place. And so you have to survive in this world as a person, and you don't know what's going on. Like, you don't know who you meet could have been one of these superhuman people. They might have a secret power you don't know. They might be completely out of control. And the story starts with a team of people coming to a location where a bunch of superheroes, I believe Helios was in charge of them, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and they created a place called, it was Bastion, right? I'm pretty sure about that.
Yeah.
Yeah. They make a place called the Bastion, which is for human survivors to just be. But when they get there, this little group finds out that it's completely ruined. And they have to get the hell out. And that's when they meet Helios, and that's when the story begins. Is that a good summary? Did I miss anything?
That's pretty much it.
Okay,
Yeah.
cool. Whew. But like, speaking of all this stuff, speaking of archetypes and things like that, one of the things that I think does a really good job, because both of you do a lot of work to not overload the reader in the beginning. Like, I didn't feel like I was having to insert words into my brain with a needle. But Colin, you also do a lot of work to get across like a ton of information in those first 3 pages. And the way in which you do Helios, the way in which you've made these characters, you've made them archetypes. We talked about that. You do a really good job of making Helios seem heroic, but also like a person. Is there anything that you had to do? Were there versions of Helios where he was more superhuman, superhero, Superman, and then you had to tone him down?
There was definitely at some point a version of Helios that was very Superman-like. I mean, he is the Superman archetype.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, you're right. We wanted to show that he, as a hero, he does do heroic things, but those heroic things also have consequences on the world, and not necessarily positive consequences. And I figured, I mean, it took a bit of iteration, but I took a lot of inspiration from other properties that I felt did the job really well in portraying the hero as a very human character.
Mm-hmm.
So, and one of those properties, Metal Gear Solid.
Yeah, that's actually a really good point.
Yeah, so Solid Snake, Big Boss, they're both the heroes of that game. Although Big Boss later becomes the villain, but that's a whole other story.
Mm-hmm.
And what I felt that as characters, they were very well developed. They had their motivations. They had um, not only their heroic moments but also their failures. And the failure part was what I grabbed onto in trying to portray Helios as not only a hero of the golden age but also the catalyst that caused the fall of it.
Yeah. And like in I think Metal Gear Solid is an interesting touch point because I can see in that series the team that worked on that trying their hardest to not only elevate these characters to heroes, to people that everyone talks about, but also they tried really hard to pop that bubble once in a while to show how silly they were, how like humorous they could be, but also how wrong they could be about something. And I think that when you have a main character, it can be really hard to do that, where you spend so much time with them, you build empathy with them, you see their reasoning for why they're making decisions, and you have to work really hard to show the audience that they are not infallible. When it came to the other aspects of these designs, Colin, did you is there anything that you've learned about how you show this post-apocalyptic world? Is there anything that you didn't know when you first started?
Starting out, I didn't know a lot of things because this was my first graphic novel.
Whoa, you're doing a really good job.
Thank you. So I had done some web comics before, but they were just sort of one-offs. But this was my first real like constructed narrative to work with.
Mm-hmm.
And I, and this is a testament of Adam's writing and how good and how clear and concise it can be. That when it comes to the visuals, it's not terribly difficult for me to put pen to paper or stylus to tablet, just because I can see it so clearly. And speaking of our inspirations, like I mentioned Metal Gear Solid, but I've had other inspirations that I've tried to channel into to this world, and that's the thing. The world is a character in and of itself.
Yeah.
It 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 shows us who these characters are, because they're not necessarily always just facing a villain. Oftentimes it's the world that they're in, that it's bleak, it's hostile. There are portions that are safe, and then portions that aren't.
Yeah,
But yeah,
I really like that about what the style you've picked and how you portray this is sometimes when I get into post-apocalyptic fiction, in an effort to try to make things seem threatening in order to show the degradation of society and breakdown, it can just feel hopeless. So it'll feel like you get to a point where you're like, well, they're screwed. Okay, I'm done reading the story now. And here, I think that you have this interesting contrast where when they're in the Bastion and trying to get out, when, like in this scene, there is someone talking in the chat right now about fleeing the Quietus, which is a character that we'll talk about in a bit that is currently in the story. That's very threatening. And I know the gravity of the situation. I can feel the weight. But when they're just walking around and there's like nothing going on and they just have to travel somewhere, you do these really great perspective shots that open up but don't feel like they're going to die in the next second or something. Like you give us the chance as the reader, you give us the chance to breathe. And I really appreciate the work from both of you. Because it sounds like, Adam, you have some influence on the pacing in that way. But you both have built something where it's not just slamming me with cynicism and that everyone's going to die. But I still feel that threat. Adam, was that an intentional thing that you wanted to have a variety in the tone, or did it sort of come naturally? Was it a decision you made early?
Yeah, I think especially for post-apocalyptic stories, the general trope for that genre is that everything sucks and everything's just really bad, and then maybe in the 11th hour something can turn good, and maybe like that something good is small, like in the case of the road, it's finding more people to be with, um, or it could be that, you know, life will go on, or the planet will find a way. That wasn't the goal here. Like I didn't want anyone to be sad 24/7 while going through this, because this is more of it's a post-apocalyptic setting, but it's a story that's more about redemption and coming to terms with the choices you've made, and growing from them. And every single person in this cast has something that they need to grow from and learn from, and that's more important to me than hammering you with just gore and violence like 24/7. Even the villains, even the monsters themselves are reflections of anxieties, or unfulfilled wants or dreams that, you know, they can very easily consume us, and we see that in it's a little harder to see, I think, for the time being in Quietus. But that's something that you see very clearly in Titan, who is the previous
Yes.
antagonist for a brief period.
Yeah. And it's that, gosh, Titan is a character that as soon as I saw Titan and I learned, I had an idea of what might have been going on with them as soon as I saw them, but it was confirmed later. The way in which both of you handled that, I really want to commend you for, because there is a version of this in another reality where you could have really hammered home on the melancholy of that, of the tragedy of that, but you gave it this space where I could stop and think about how horrifying that is, or how, as a person who likes to protect the people I care about, how that can be mutated in some way, or warped. And you're right. Like, these characters, that's one thing that I really like about this, where I'm a big fan of tabletop role-playing games, and often the games think that your character dying is the consequence, rather than losing the arc of the story of their journey that they're on. And for me, I'm terrified of Helios dying, not because I'm terrified of gore. I want to see where he grows. I want him to change, and I want Diana to be nicer to some people once in a while. But like, if Diana were to eat it in this last chapter, I would feel very sad. For many reasons, but one of them is that her arc gets cut short. She dies before she's made any growth, and you giving us that opportunity in this is awesome. Like, when you talk about this, everyone having an arc, everyone learning from something, you're talking about these characters, especially Titan, now that you mention them, is sort of like metaphoric. Colin, does this factor into how you portray them and how you design them?
Totally, yeah. So for example, for Titan, Adam had given me a brief of what he was like in the Golden Age, and see him for a brief period in the first couple of pages, and Helios even talks about him, and just describing his personality, like even though his power was basically super strength, but he was gentle and compassionate.
Yeah.
And what happens when that gets twisted, when that sentiment of having this goal to protect the people and the things that you care about gets dialed up to the extreme, and what does that look like?
Yeah. Like, I noticed right away when you see them at first, they have a face that is capable of being kind. Like, there is a softness to that character, where there are some designs that I've seen where there's no way they can smile based on the way they're drawn. Or if they did try to smile, it looked creepy. And I could see very deliberately that you had made Titan to be someone who could be friendly, who And there was more fear on their face than fury, and that freaked me out, like seeing that happening. And I see that in some of the other designs that you've done for these characters. Was that something, like, did you have to go through some iterations with Adam to be like, is this right, or does it come naturally to you?
I definitely confer with Adam. Like, I'll do a few sketches, send it his way, would talk about it. Quietus, for example, took a little bit of iteration to get right. Just so one of the things that we did, and I was talking to Adam about this when we were working on this current issues 4, 5, and 6, was that whenever Quietus shows up, or whenever our group is in danger and in very close proximity to Quietus, I wanted to shift the color palette towards a sickly green.
Ooh.
Right. So you're not necessarily seeing Quietus as a whole figure, whether he's on panel or not. But once it starts shifting green, then you know he's coming.
Oh, interesting.
So
I hadn't noticed that.
That was part of his character design, and it's not something that's obvious on his outward appearance, because he's just like a creepy shadow creature puppet kind of thing. And but here, for example, this page, when they're in the house, compared to the previous page when they're outdoors, with the blue sky, things look fairly normal. I mean, the town looks abandoned, and suddenly Quietus shows up. And
I was gonna say there are a ton of color hints that Colin, just without even me really saying anything, employs all over the comic. This one's a great example because light is something that Quietus doesn't like. So seeing the little bit of light at the very end of that last panel, you know that they're at least running to safety. But a huge defining factor for Helios's design, which is something that I did not suggest, was changing Helios's speech bubble to be that golden yellow that's the same as his eyes.
Yeah. That is really effective.
Yeah, it helps immediately distinguish him as someone who was important, who was like either a leader or special. Like even when he is sad or melancholy, or when he looks like he's because there are plenty of panels where Helios does not look like he's very much in control, and he's just sort of stewing in his own sadness.
He's not always smiling.
Yeah, he's still, anything he says, you're sort of compelled to listen, and that's just because he was such a heroic figure. That history, that looking for the word, I guess the ideal of what he was. Yeah, the lineage, the history behind his actions, the weight of that is still there in his words, no matter what he's saying, and it's a blessing and a curse. But that subtle little addition was just purely like from Colin.
Yeah, and I think like you can see it right here when he says "kill it." Like, I think that's very interesting because it does draw my eye. It's different than everything else, and using that as a tool to distinguish this character from all the other people, that is very fascinating. I had not thought, because I noticed it and I thought it was cool, but I had not thought about the impact of it on me as a reader, like in the experience of me as a reader. That's really fascinating. Whose idea was that? Colin, that was your idea, right?
That was, yeah.
That's really cool. Good job, Colin.
Thank you.
You did it.
Yeah.
Woohoo.
We are not necessarily at the end of the time, but we're slowly going to land the plane. But before we do, I want to talk about all this other cool stuff that you guys have been doing on Folklore. Like Adam, you've been writing short stories. Can you talk a little bit about like what compelled you to start that way, to start doing them? Like what has the process been like?
Yeah. So there's a lot of lore to the world, and a lot that we together want, like, there's only so many hours in the day that Colin can illustrate and bring folklore to life on a visual level. But there's a lot that we want to discuss and a lot that we want to share and talk about. And sometimes it's just a cool monster that we want to like invent, or like this guy here, this crow nightmare man. Sometimes it's just an interesting story or perspective. Folklore is I don't want to say that we're all about representation in a way that like every single issue is going to have some new diverse face, but like diversity and representation is really important to us. And there's just avenues that the comic will not go to because the story isn't going. We're never going to drive the story just for the sake of representation. So there are just some peoples and cultures and backgrounds that won't have an appearance in folklore, but we still want to have those conversations. And that's where the short stories kind of come in. It also gives me a time to talk about the world and showcase the world, and gives Colin a little bit more time to work on the comic when we want to update something for our readers and still give them something to enjoy while they're waiting for new issues to come out.
It also gives me a lot of information to work on. Like even though like these short stories don't directly fit into the main comic, that's still information that I can use.
Yeah. And like, one thing I haven't been able to mention yet is Folklore has a wonderful pace where it doesn't feel like you're getting bored and going like, there needs to be a fight here, we're getting bored. Like, it doesn't feel artificial. But when action happens, like in this scene here, this comes so quickly and it doesn't feel random, but it does feel like intense. So encounters don't last long in Folklore from what I've seen so far. They are very hectic. And Colin, you do a really good job of conveying a ton of information during these scenes. Both of you, I know both of you worked collaboratively on this. But then like I was saying before, there are moments of breath. There are moments afterwards to like chill out after, they have to run from something. And I think that you doing these short stories, Adam, now correct me if I'm wrong, feels like a way for you to get out a lot of information and to talk about a lot of fun things, but keep the pacing the way that you have in Folklore, like the pages that Colin is building. Is that right?
Yeah, that's basically it. Like we can, with the short stories, we can say like, okay, let's have a short story about the Federation and talk about what that was or what that was like. That's not something that we can immediately do in the comic, but via the short stories, if someone's interested in learning more about, what life was like on a reservation during the Golden Age, or what life was like being a Federation officer, or being a regular person, or living in an apartment complex or a city or community. Those are all the things, like what happened to zoos in the apocalypse. These are all sort of questions that we can answer and still maintain the flow of information that we have in the comic. It's just nothing but like bonus data for you to soak in.
Yeah. And there's been plenty of like manga, comics, media where I have been getting really into the story that I'm in, and then the author goes, oh crap, I need to like explain how like ships work or what's going on. And one of my friends at one point pointed out a series that they've been liking where they started to figure out that as soon as you got a flashback about a character, that meant that they were going to die. Because they needed to get out some emotional information about the character. And here you are doing a really good job of not giving me any hints on what, like who's about to die or like what's about to happen. Colin, you have the color hints of like, oh, there's something dangerous happening, but it's not like you're pointing an arrow at a person where it's like, oh, suddenly we learned about their tragic backstory. They're going to die now.
Right. No, it's more of a vague,
it's like a tone.
Like,
yeah.
Yeah.
And I really like that. I really like how, for people who are interested in finding out a lot more of this structure, which Adam, you've done such a good job of building a solid structure for everything to hinge on, the way that the superheroes are acting, the way that, the foundation worked and how it fell apart. people can dig into that and see something from one individual's perspective, where here the comic seems to be a bit more of like a third person thing, where we don't get any insight into people's thoughts in the comic, which I really like. Colin, last that we were talking, we were talking about like trading cards that you both have been working on.
Yeah, so the trading cards, this is something that we had been wanting to do for our patrons, just as an extra bonus, but also just something fun to do on the side. We don't know yet if we want to make an actual trading card game, but we do know that we want to make trading cards or collectible cards, because we think it would be fun, and it's also a fun way to just showcase more of the characters and more of the world of folklore.
Yeah, that's interesting because, like, man, I've never thought about. I know I'm not saying that you should make them in universe, but the thought of someone coming across a Helios trading card in this setting, like right now, in where the story is, would be weirdly poetic. You know,
I
like
could definitely say they exist.
That's wild. That's really cool. Like, I like the idea of, you know, like bottle caps and stuff in Fallout being anachronistic and kind of like parody when you see them when everything is so screwed up. I love the idea of someone just like stepping on a Helios trading card, picking it off their boot and going, oh yeah, I remember this stuff.
I mean, technically, I think it's in issue 4. Greg comes across a poster for the Federation, and there's little hints as well, like because that's the Federation is what Helios technically built up. So you'll definitely see like little bits of the past that are still there that are kind of golden era, like posters and comics or video games or cereal brands, stuff like that, where it used to be a brand, it used to be a company. So you'll definitely have a chance to see like that kind of stuff pop up every now and then.
That's really cool. Are you going to release the trading cards at some point? Like what is the plan? Are these like fun things to post online?
The plan right now is still in super early. Like, I'm just doing sketches for them right now. But yeah,
Cool.
The plan is to release them, give them out to our patrons especially, and to have some sort of physical, tangible thing to give out at conventions as well.
That's awesome. Can either of you post your Patreon in the chat so that people can know where it is?
Yeah, sure.
So as we wind down, I would like to ask you both, what's next for Folklore? Like, what right now in the current chapter, you see some of these. Ooh, I did not. I apologize.
It's all good.
No, I thought that I had added you. My apologies. I will.
I'll send you.
I got it.
Yeah.
I apologize.
Nope.
Here we go.
We're not bots, I swear.
Apologies. We set it up so that the URLs got caught, but my bad. I must have set something wrong. So this is their Patreon, and this is where you can get some of those trading cards once Colin and Adam get done with them. So what is next for Folklore right now? The chapter, we're at chapter 6, right? Which is you're calling them issues, like issue 6.
Mm-hmm, yeah.
Yeah. So we're at issue 6, and the crew do you have a name for the crew right now, like internally?
I think I just call them the gang,
Okay.
which is
we
always
usually
sunny.
refer to them as the gang.
So the gang have encountered Quietus, and they are trying to get the heck away. Can you reveal anything about what's coming up next?
So, their big mission. We have Folklore kind of broken down into major and minor story arcs, and their major story arc is to eventually get to the lair of Dr. Necrosis, I believe, which is a very 80s, super 80s.
I love that name. I really like that name.
Yeah, very, very theatrical man, Dr. Necrosis was.
Very dramatic.
Yeah.
so their goal is to get to his lair and acquire weaponry that they can use to fight back against some of these abominations that have shown up. And that's part of the reason that fights are very, very fast and very brutal in Folklore, is because they're all very one-sided.
They're very
yeah.
ill-equipped to handle the crisis at hand.
So as far as the immediate plot line, we can say that that's where they're headed, and they'll have a few stops along the way before they get there. But I don't want to give away too much more.
Obviously. And then, Colin, do you have anything that you want to talk about coming up, or the trading cards? Good.
I'm currently working on the trading cards. As far as the what's coming up next for the main comic, I can say that I've started on issue 7. We've done our script breakdown, our panel breakdowns, and I'll be working on thumbnails and layouts next. So hopefully I can get it done in time.
Awesome. Well, as I said before, I'm going to repost it in chat that you can read their comic at folklorecomic.com. You can follow Adam at 34th Gingerbread on Twitter, and Colin at unartifacts. You can see the spellings in the chat. And thank you both. Thank you both for doing this. This is like our first interview thing that we've done. And it's been really fun talking to you again.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yeah, this has been awesome.
Awesome. So, for everyone, we are going to be doing, we're going to be continuing this tomorrow. We're going to have a panel where we have, where we bring on Taylor Robin from Never Satisfied, and some other, and Atla, the editor, from Hiveworks. We're going to have them talking about comics and like recommendations. So they'll talk about the comics that they like currently, and things that they're enjoying. And then after that, I am going to be having an interview with Brienne from HarPG. And I'm pretty excited about that. I hope to see you all there. Thank you all for spending this time with me. Again, thank you to Adam and Colin. And I am going to be signing off right now. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Goodbye.
Stay safe.